The heavy scent of commercial bleach always lingered on Preston Hayes's right palm, a permanent chemical glove that masked the older, deeper smell of vintage piano ivory. He was 62 years old, completely blind, wearing a gray hotel uniform, crisp enough to belong to a military general, and he was currently sitting on the cold marble floor of the Grand Meridian ballroom with his wooden cane shattered into two jagged pieces 3 feet away. Above him stood Gerald Whitmore, a billionaire whose personal wealth could have bought the entire city block, looking down with nostrils flared as if a sewer pipe had burst beneath his custom Tom Ford loafers. "Get this street animal away from my instrument!" Whitmore's voice did not shake. It vibrated with the absolute quiet authority of a man who bought human silence by the metric ton. Preston did not move. His empty palms remained pressed flat against the floor, feeling the expensive vibration of a $100,000 Steinway grand piano that had just been tuned for the evening's high society gala. A second ago, Preston had simply touched the edge of the mahogany casing, his ancient fingers merely seeking the familiar grain of wood he used to live for. But to Whitmore, a black man in a janitor's uniform touching a masterwork of musical engineering was nothing less than property damage. "Look at those filthy, cracked hands," Whitmore continued, turning his back to address his inner circle of corporate sycophants, who instantly shifted their postures to mimic his disgust. "They smell like garbage and industrial vinegar. You clean toilets, old man. You scrub the grease off the floors where real people walk. If your rotten skin leaves a single grease mark on this ivory, I will ensure you spend the rest of your miserable days eating out of a dumpster behind the station. Stand up and crawl back to your broom." The ballroom was vast, a cathedral of old Washington money filled with 400 wealthy patrons, senators and foreign diplomats who suddenly stopped their champagne small talk to watch the public execution of a servant's dignity. Nobody moved to help him. Not a single person in a diamond necklace or a silk bow tie stepped forward to offer a hand to the old man on the floor. To them, Preston Hayes was not a human being who had made a mistake. He was a minor aesthetic blemish on an otherwise perfect evening of philanthropy. But what Gerald Whitmore did not know, what the senators in the front row could never guess, and what the entire room was about to discover, was that those identical cracked, bleach-stained hands had once received standing ovations from 3 different American presidents inside the East Room of the White House. 12 hours before the hands were called dirty, before the wooden cane was snapped, and before the billionaire decided to showcase his casual cruelty, Preston Hayes woke up inside his 3rd-floor apartment in southeast Washington, D.C. The time was exactly 5:15 a.m., a cold, gray hour where the city belonged only to the birds and the men who cleaned up after the rich. The elevator in his building had been broken since the heavy snows of the previous winter, leaving the hallways smelling of damp concrete and old cooking grease. In the dark, Preston lay perfectly still beneath his thin wool blanket, his ears tracking the rhythm of the old cast-iron radiator beneath the windowsill. 2 quick clicks, a long whistling hiss, a 4-second pause, and then the cycle repeated. For the past 6 years, since the darkness had permanently claimed his eyes and the silence had claimed his life, that radiator was the only orchestra Preston Hayes had left. He did not need a clock. His body knew the exact dimension of his isolation. He slid his legs out of bed, his bare feet meeting the cold linoleum floor with absolute familiarity. 14 steps to the kitchen sink. Not 13, not 15. He walked with his left hand lightly trailing the wall, his fingertips reading the subtle braille of his own poverty. The rough patch where the drywall had cracked during the summer humidity, the sharp corner of the wooden door frame, and the loose, curling edge of the floral wallpaper that his late wife Eleanor had chosen 3 decades ago. The apartment was a physical map of a love story that had ended in a hospital room 6 years prior. Eleanor had been a woman of order and infinite tenderness. When the doctors first told them that Preston's condition, retinitis pigmentosa, was degenerative and completely irreversible, she did not cry in front of him. Instead, she went to a local stationery store, bought dozens of sheets of heavy Braille paper, and spent 3 months labeling every single object in their home. She labeled the spice jars, the canned soups, the medicine bottles, and the dresser drawers. She was building a world for him to live in after her own light went out. Cancer took her within 4 short months of his final diagnosis, leaving Preston to navigate a completely dark apartment with nothing but the memory of her voice and the tactile labels she had left behind. On the small kitchen counter behind the salt cellar sat his jar of instant coffee. His thumb rubbed over the faded Braille sticker that read, "Coffee, 2 scoops." He boiled the water by sound, listening for the sharp, chaotic bubbles that signaled the transition from simmer to boil. While the mug steeped, Preston walked back to his small nightstand where a single silver-framed photograph sat. He had not actually seen the image in nearly 17 years, yet he touched it every single morning with the reverence of a monk handling a holy relic. His calloused fingertips traced the cool glass, his mind effortlessly projecting the colors and shapes frozen beneath it. In that photograph, a 35-year-old Preston Hayes, his eyes still bright and filled with vision, stood tall in a tailored tuxedo, his right hand firmly clasped by a man wearing a dark blue suit and a small American flag pin on his lapel. The background was a beautiful blur of gold drapes and crystal chandeliers, the East Room of the White House. Preston did not allow his fingers to linger on the glass for more than 5 seconds. Nostalgia was a dangerous drug for a man who carried a mop for a living. It made the handle feel heavier and the water look dirtier. He carefully replaced the frame exactly where it belonged, adjusted his posture, and went to iron his uniform. He did everything by touch, utilizing the iron's heat to smooth out every single wrinkle on his gray hotel shirt. The collar had to be perfectly flat, the sleeves creased straight, and his gold-plated name badge pinned exactly 2 inches below his left shoulder seam. Most men in his position, earning $12 an hour to wipe down the toilets of wealthy tourists, would have thrown on a wrinkled shirt from the hamper. But Preston could still hear Eleanor's voice every time he took the iron out. "Preston, people will try to judge your soul by the work you do with your hands. Don't you ever give them permission to think you are small." So he ironed. Every morning without fail, he dressed as if he were about to perform for royalty, even though he was only going to perform for a yellow plastic bucket. The bus ride from Southeast D.C. to the grand entrance of the Grand Meridian Hotel took 40 minutes on a good morning. Preston always took the 3rd row on the left side, the seat directly over the wheel well, where the bus heater blew a steady stream of hot, dry air against his ankles. He liked the window seat, not because he could see the gray monuments or the rushing government workers outside, but because the bus driver, a middle-aged woman named Gloria, always acknowledged his existence. "Morning, Mr. Hayes, watch your step on that wet curb," she would say when he climbed the stairs, and "Have a beautiful day, Mr. Hayes," when his white cane tapped its way back down to the pavement. 2 simple sentences, 18 words in total. Some days those 18 words were the only conversation Preston Hayes would have with another human being for 24 hours. The Grand Meridian was not just a hotel. It was an architectural monument to American power and international wealth. Located just a few blocks from the White House, its lobby featured imported white Carrara marble floors that required constant crystallization, hand-painted neoclassical ceilings depicting Roman gods of commerce, and a central crystal chandelier that rumor said cost more than the entire apartment building where Preston lived. For 9 long years, Preston had walked past that marble, pushing a heavy rubber bucket filled with steaming water and pine-scented soap. For 9 years, he had been an invisible ghost in a gray shirt, stepping silently into the shadows whenever a man in a $3,000 suit or a woman wrapped in soft mink walked past. He had learned the art of becoming part of the architecture. When guests looked in his direction, their eyes simply slid past him, treating him with the exact same level of attention they gave to the polished brass trash cans or the decorative palm trees in the corners. He was not angry about this invisibility. In fact, he found a strange, quiet comfort in it. It allowed him to keep his internal world completely intact, separate from the shallow vanity of the people who inhabited the lobby. His only real connection to the living world inside that hotel was a 34-year-old evening porter named Darnell Cooper. Darnell was a massive man built like an NFL linebacker with a voice that sounded like a bass section in a Southern Baptist choir. Darnell had been working at the hotel for 3 years, and from his very first week he had made it a personal rule to carry Preston's heavy supply cart from the basement laundry room to the service elevator at the beginning of every shift. "You don't need to do that, Darnell. I've got legs like an old mule," Preston would always argue, his white cane tapping against the cart's wheel. "I know I don't have to, Mr. Hayes," Darnell would reply, his deep laugh echoing down the concrete corridor. "But my mama told me if I don't help a gentleman of your caliber, she'll come up here and beat me with her own shoe. Now get in the elevator before I carry you too." Darnell was also the only living soul at the Grand Meridian who knew that Preston Hayes possessed a secret that could silence a room. It had happened entirely by accident 2 years ago during a brutal winter storm that had kept most of the staff trapped at the hotel past midnight. Darnell was walking past the old employee break room in the deep basement, a forgotten concrete bunker filled with broken plastic chairs and an outdated vending machine, when he heard a sound that made him drop his clipboard. It was music. Not the cheap tinny music from a kitchen radio, but something massive, rich, and achingly beautiful. It was an intricate classical melody that felt completely wrong coming from behind a door with a peeling staff-only sign. Darnell pushed the door open an inch and peered inside. There sat Preston Hayes, still in his sweat-stained gray uniform, sitting on a wooden stool in front of a battered, out-of-tune upright piano that an old manager had donated to the break room 20 years ago. Preston's eyes were completely closed, his head tilted back toward the cracked ceiling. His fingers were moving across the yellowed keys with the terrifying speed and precision of a hawk diving for prey. The music didn't sound like it was coming from the old piano. It sounded like Preston was pulling it directly out of his own chest, using the broken wood merely as a filter. Darnell stood in that doorway for 20 minutes, his breath catching in his throat, tears welling up in his eyes without his permission. When Preston finally struck the last lingering chord, Darnell silently pulled the door shut and walked away, his heart pounding against his ribs. The next morning, while they were loading clean rags into the supply closet, Darnell looked at the old man for a long time before speaking. "Who are you, man, for real? You ain't no janitor." Preston had merely smiled that quiet, knowing smile that revealed nothing while acknowledging everything. "I'm the man who cleans the lobby, Darnell, same as yesterday. Don't go making up stories about an old man whose knees click when it rains." What Darnell didn't know, because Preston's pride would never allow him to speak it aloud, was the true weight of the ghost that walked inside that uniform. He didn't know about the full scholarship to the Thornton Conservatory of Music in 1981, where a young Preston Hayes had been the only black student in his class, practicing 8 hours a day until his fingertips bled onto the keys. He didn't know about the legendary debut recital at Carnegie Hall that had caused the notoriously brutal New York music critics to use words like miraculous and the future of American classical interpretation. Most of all, Darnell didn't know about the official invitations stamped with the gold crest of the President of the United States. Preston had performed his original compositions for 3 consecutive administrations, moving heads of state to tears with his ability to blend the rigorous intellect of European classical tradition with the deep, sorrowful soul of black spiritual music. But then came the darkness. The small spots in his peripheral vision that he first mistook for dust on his glasses. Then the night blindness. Then the terrifying diagnosis from the Johns Hopkins specialists, retinitis pigmentosa. The curtain was coming down, and there was no hand on earth large enough to stop it. By his 44th year, the world had become a single unbroken sheet of midnight, and that was when the invitations stopped. It wasn't because his technique had faded. His muscle memory was so absolute that he could play a 12-page concerto without missing a single 16th note in total darkness. The real tragedy was the music industry itself. The high-priced agents, the international promoters, the classical record labels, they didn't know how to market a blind black classical artist who refused to be turned into a cheap inspiration story. They wanted him to do morning talk shows, where he would sit on a bright yellow couch, while a well-meaning host patted his hand and asked how he managed to find the piano keys without his eyes. They wanted a tragedy with a happy ending. They wanted an inspirational mascot, not an uncompromising artist. Preston refused every single contract that required him to sell his dignity for a concert date. "I am a musician," he told his final agent during a screaming match in a New York office. "I am not a circus act for rich people to pity. If they cannot listen to my art without needing to cry over my eyes, then they don't deserve to hear the notes." So he walked away. He let the silence swallow his career whole. He moved to Washington, took a job where nobody looked at his face, and buried his past so deep that even he sometimes forgot the sound of his own name being spoken in an auditorium. Underneath his small bed, inside a locked cedar box that smelled of dried lavender and old paper, lay 3 pieces of sheet music. Each one was signed with a personal note of gratitude from 3 different men who had run the country. He had not opened that box in over 5 years. Touching the physical proof of a life you have lost is a very specific, sharp kind of torture, and Preston preferred the dull ache of his current routine to the stabbing pain of remembrance. Currently, he was 2 months behind on his rent, and his landlord had slipped a bright pink eviction notice under his door the previous Tuesday. Preston had felt the stiff, cheap texture of the paper on his kitchen floor, known exactly what it meant by its weight, and placed it on the counter next to his cold coffee without opening it. Eleanor's wedding ring was gone, too. Pawned 4 months ago at a shop on Pennsylvania Avenue to cover his pharmacy co-pays for his blood pressure medication. The ring was gone, but the deep, smooth indentation on his left ring finger remained a small valley of pale skin, where gold had lived for 30 years. He found himself rubbing that empty valley with his thumb whenever the lobby grew too cold, a silent habit from a life that used to fit him perfectly. If you had walked past Preston Hayes on the street that morning, watching him guide his gray uniform through the crowded bus terminal with his white cane tapping rhythmically against the concrete, you wouldn't have given him a second look. To the world he was just another broken piece of urban scenery. But the world was about to be forced to look. At exactly 6:45 p.m., a pristine black Rolls-Royce Phantom glided silently up to the private VIP entrance of the Grand Meridian Hotel, its polished paint reflecting the gold street lamps like liquid obsidian. Before the massive vehicle had even come to a complete stop, two hotel doormen in crimson coats leapt forward, their white-gloved hands moving in perfect synchronization to open the rear doors. A third assistant quickly stepped in, holding a massive black silk umbrella aloft, despite the fact that there wasn't a single cloud in the evening sky. This was the specific artificial atmosphere that surrounded Gerald Whitmore wherever he chose to grace the earth with his presence. People did not merely serve him, they actively anticipated hypothetical problems that did not exist, terrified that a single second of real-world discomfort might cause the billionaire to withdraw his financial favor from their establishment. He stepped out of the vehicle with a slow, deliberate movement that radiated total ownership of the pavement beneath his handmade Italian leather shoes. At 58 years old, Whitmore possessed the kind of meticulously curated appearance that only hundreds of millions of dollars could maintain. His hair was a silver fox masterpiece, cut weekly by a stylist who flew in from New York. His tuxedo was a custom wool and silk blend from Tom Ford that cost more than an average American family earned in an entire year. And on his left wrist sat a Patek Philippe perpetual calendar watch that caught the lobby's chandelier light, throwing off bright, expensive reflections like a small, captive sun. Gerald did not look at the doorman. He did not nod. He did not blink in their direction. He did not offer a casual thank you. To him, the service staff were not individuals with names or lives. They were simply high-functioning appliances that came with the hotel, no more deserving of a greeting than the automatic glass doors. Behind him stepped his wife, Audrey Whitmore. She was an elegant, remarkably thin blonde woman wearing a sleeveless emerald green gown and a triple-strand necklace of South Sea pearls that she touched constantly with her right hand, a nervous, repetitive gesture common among people who are deeply insecure about the permanence of their luxury. Audrey walked exactly 2 steps behind her husband as they entered the lobby. This distance was not an accident. It was a deeply ingrained survival mechanism she had developed over 20 years of marriage. Walking beside Gerald meant risking the possibility of interrupting his line of sight or stepping on his stride, infractions that would inevitably result in a late-night lecture inside the limousine spoken in a terrifyingly calm, icy whisper that never rose in volume but left her feeling completely hollowed out for days. Tonight was the annual Whitmore Foundation Gala for the Arts and Philanthropy, an event that had become the crown jewel of the Washington spring social season. 400 invitations had been sent out 6 months ago, and 400 of the most powerful people in the country had rearranged their schedules to attend sitting senators, Wall Street hedge fund managers, network news anchors, and old European money that had been wealthy for so many generations they had forgotten what an invoice looked like. On paper, the gala was designed to raise $3 million for underprivileged music and arts programs in the public schools of Washington, D.C. In reality, the charity was merely a tax-deductible stage set, and Gerald Whitmore was the only actor who mattered. The moment his tailored shoulders cleared the grand entrance of the ballroom, the entire room underwent a visible psychological shift. Conversations dropped by 10 decibels as people adjusted their tone to appear more serious. A senior sommelier carrying a vintage bottle of Bordeaux changed his direction mid-stride to ensure he was within Gerald's immediate turning radius. A young woman from the catering team, fresh out of culinary school, straightened her back so quickly she nearly caused her silver tray of smoked salmon tarts to slide onto the carpet. This was the true nature of modern power. It did not need to shout or announce its arrival. It simply walked into a room, and every other living creature automatically adjusted their internal gravity to accommodate it. Gerald moved through the crowd with the slow, proprietary grace of a landlord inspecting a well-kept garden. He shook hands with a high-ranking member of the Senate Appropriations Committee, leaned in close to whisper a joke to a billionaire real estate developer that made the man laugh far too loudly, and accepted a crystal flute of vintage champagne from a passing waiter. He held the glass up to the light, his sharp blue eyes studying the crystal surface for 3 long, agonizing seconds, while the waiter stood frozen before him. Gerald then handed the glass back without letting a single drop touch his lips. "Bring me another," Gerald said, his voice smooth and entirely devoid of heat. "This crystal has 2 faint smudges near the rim. Someone handled it without clean gloves. Fix it." The waiter's face remained completely expressionless, trained by years of elite service to swallow his own humanity, but his fingers trembled noticeably as he took the rejected flute back to the kitchen. This was Gerald's particular art form. He never made a loud scene, he never lost his temper, and he never used vulgarity. Instead, he relied on a continuous stream of small, precise, and calculated cruelties to remind everyone within his zip code of the immense uncrossable ocean that separated his life from theirs. A few yards away, near the edge of the main stage, stood a young black cellist named Maya Lin. She was 23 years old, a recent graduate of the Juilliard School, and she had been invited to perform a brief 5-minute solo before the evening's main concert began. She was wearing a simple black dress she had bought on sale, and she was holding her instrument's bow with white knuckles, her heart racing as she stared out at the sea of diamonds and tuxedos. When she saw Gerald walking in her direction, she took a deep breath, stepped forward, and extended her right hand. "Mr. Whitmore, it is such an incredible honor to be here tonight. Your foundation scholarship is the only reason I was able to buy my strings this year." Gerald didn't stop walking. He didn't look at her face. He didn't slow his pace by a fraction of a mile per hour. And he didn't take his hands out of his tuxedo pockets. Instead, he turned his head slightly toward his personal assistant who was walking beside him. "Is the real entertainment here yet? Or am I expected to listen to student rehearsals while I eat my salad?" he asked, loud enough for Maya and the 3 nearest tables to hear every syllable clearly. Maya's extended hand remained hanging in the empty air for a long, humiliating moment. Slowly her fingers curled back into her palm, and she lowered her arm to her side, her face burning red as she stared down at the polished floor. It was the specific kind of lesson that the world teaches young artists of color when they mistake a billionaire's tax write-off for genuine human generosity. 10 minutes later, Gerald stood at the foot of the stage, his right hand slowly tracing the glossy black finish of the Steinway grand piano that sat beneath a massive focused white spotlight. This specific instrument belonged to him. He had purchased it 3 years ago for $240,000, a handcrafted masterpiece made of aged spruce and high-tensile steel, one of fewer than 80 produced in that particular production run. He had permanently loaned it to the Grand Meridian Hotel on the strict condition that it only be used for events where his foundation was present. A small, polished brass plate was bolted into the wood directly beneath the music rack, engraved with the words, "The Gerald Whitmore Patronage Collection." He touched that brass plate now, with the possessive, smug satisfaction of a hunter touching the antlers of a prize stag mounted on his wall. This piano was not a vehicle for art. It was a physical monument to his personal taste and his ability to own beautiful things that other men could only dream of hearing. He turned to his inner circle. 3 corporate vice presidents who wore identical black suits and possessed the uncanny ability to laugh at his jokes 2 seconds before the punchline arrived. Do you know what the fundamental difference between our class and the rest of society is? Gerald asked, his hand still resting on the $240,000 lid, as he gestured vaguely toward the line of kitchen staff standing against the far wall. They think small permanently. They look at an instrument like this, and they think about the music. We look at it, and we understand the capital required to make the wood sing. They are content to listen. We are the ones who own the silence. The 3 men nodded in perfect unison, one of them letting out a quiet, appreciative chuckle. At that exact same moment, less than 40 feet away, behind the heavy double-padded swinging doors of the kitchen service corridor, Preston Hayes was kneeling on the concrete floor, using a gray microfiber cloth to wipe up a spilled pitcher of ice water that a hurried banquet waiter had dropped. His broken wooden cane was tucked under his left armpit, his blind eyes facing the baseboards. Just then, the heavy ballroom doors swung open for a brief second as a captain brought out a tray of prime rib. Through that tiny gap in the wood, the sound of the Steinway piano being given its final tuning adjustments drifted into the dirty service hallway. It wasn't a song, just a technician striking 3 quick notes in the upper register, followed by a deep, resonant bass chord. The notes were clean, bright, and perfectly balanced, cutting through the smell of roasted meat and dishwashing detergent like a bell ringing in an empty church. Preston Hayes stopped moving his cloth. His head tilted slightly to the right, his ears locking onto the lingering decay of that bass chord. His fingers still wet with ice water, and smelling of bleach gave 2 small, involuntary twitches against the floor. 2 men inside the very same room, one owned the piano, but the other was the only one who truly understood what the wood was trying to say. The evening's headline performer, an internationally acclaimed classical pianist, flew in specifically from the New York Philharmonic, was scheduled to take the stage at precisely 7:30 p.m. By 7:45 p.m., the hotel's event coordinator, a young woman named Sarah, whose face had gone completely pale beneath her makeup, was pacing frantically in the dark backstage corridor, with her phone pressed so hard against her ear that her knuckles were white. By 8 p.m., the news had finally reached the front of the house like a cold draft blowing through a warm room. The pianist's private charter flight from LaGuardia had been grounded on the tarmac due to a catastrophic electronic failure in the cockpit. There was no backup aircraft, there was no understudy available in the city, and there was absolutely no Plan B. The massive Steinway grand piano sat entirely alone under the white spotlight, its polished black lid reflecting the empty air like a beautiful, expensive promise that nobody in the room had the power to keep. 400 wealthy guests began to notice the delay. The polite, low-profile small talk turned into a restless, buzzing murmur that filled the corners of the ballroom. People began to check their gold watches, flip through the heavy linen program booklets, and glance toward the empty stage with expressions of mild annoyance. The 8 p.m. performance slot came and went with nothing but the sound of ice melting in crystal water glasses. Then 8:15 p.m. arrived. The total absence of music where art was supposed to live grew louder by the minute, threatening to turn Gerald Whitmore's multi-million-dollar showcase into a highly public embarrassment. Gerald noticed immediately. To him, an administrative failure was a personal insult, an unforgivable breach of the contract he believed he held with the universe. He walked backstage, his Tom Ford shoes clicking sharply against the concrete, and cornered Sarah against a stack of audio equipment boxes. "Where is he?" Gerald asked, his voice dropping into that terrifyingly quiet, low-register whisper that signaled an impending professional execution. "Mr. Whitmore, I am so incredibly sorry." Sarah whispered, her lower lip trembling as she held her iPad like a shield against her chest. His flight was completely grounded by the FAA. "I have already called the Washington National Symphony, the conservatory, every private agency within 50 miles. I do not care about air traffic control, and I certainly do not care about your excuses." Gerald interrupted, his face moving within 6 inches of hers, his eyes cold enough to freeze water. "I have 400 people out there who paid $5,000 a ticket to see my name on that stage. They're currently staring at an empty piece of wood. Fix it within 5 minutes, or I will personally ensure that your career in event management consists of organizing children's birthday parties in northern Idaho. Do you understand me?" He turned and walked away before she could even gather enough breath to apologize again. But there was no fix. The list of elite classical musicians in the District of Columbia who could walk onto a stage cold and perform an hour of concert-grade material without preparation was exactly 0. Sarah stood alone in the dark, staring down at her glowing phone screen, knowing with absolute certainty that her career was ending before her eyes. Meanwhile, Preston Hayes had finished his shift. The clock on the basement wall read exactly 8:15 p.m. when he unclipped his gold name badge and placed it inside his small metal locker. He had changed nothing about his nightly routine. His mop bucket had been thoroughly rinsed with scalding water. His supply cart was organized for the morning crew, and his worn winter jacket was zipped up to his chin. In his right hand he held his long white cane, its nylon tip resting against the concrete floor. He turned toward the rear service exit, the heavy steel door that opened directly into the dark alley behind the hotel's loading dock, a narrow concrete canyon that smelled permanently of old kitchen grease, rotting cabbage, and diesel exhaust from the laundry trucks. That alley was his doorway back to his ordinary life. The bus stop. Gloria's brief greeting, the 14 steps, the clicking radiator, and the cold, instant coffee. But tonight something pulled at his shoulder like a physical hand. The long service corridor ran exactly parallel to the ballroom's eastern wall. On any other night of the year, that wall was simply a thick barrier of plaster and brick that kept the noise of the rich from bleeding into the workspace of the poor. But tonight, as Preston walked toward the exit, he discovered that one of the heavy fire doors leading into the ballroom had been propped open with a heavy wooden wedge. A catering assistant had jammed it open to move a massive rack of clean coffee cups and had forgotten to remove the obstruction. Through that 5-inch gap in the plaster wall, the acoustic environment of the ballroom flooded into the service hallway. It wasn't music. It was the lingering, unresolved echo of the piano technician's work from an hour ago. The room's architecture had captured a single sustained F major chord that seemed to hang in the air like perfume refusing to dissipate into the carpet. It was an incredibly bright, open chord, the kind of sound that doesn't ask for a listener's permission. It simply demands that the universe acknowledge its mathematical perfection. Preston Hayes stopped walking. His white cane hovered exactly 1 inch above the linoleum floor, its rhythmic tapping suddenly silenced. His head turned slowly toward the open doorframe, his nostrils flaring slightly, as if he could smell the music. It wasn't a conscious decision. It was an ancient, deeply buried neurological reflex that 30 years of cleaning toilets could not erase. His right hand, wrapped around the plastic grip of his cane, began to experience small, rapid, muscular twitches. It was the absolute muscle memory of thousands of hours of stage work, a phantom limb trying to stretch its fingers after 15 years of forced amputation. He knew he should keep walking. His logical mind told him that the bus would arrive at the corner in exactly 7 minutes, and if he missed it, he would have to wait 40 minutes in the freezing D.C. drizzle. He knew that his apartment was waiting, his pink notice was waiting, and his loneliness was waiting. But that F major chord was still vibrating inside the bones of his chest, a golden frequency that made his gray uniform feel like a straitjacket. For the first time in 15 years, Preston Hayes turned his body 90 degrees to the left, away from the exit, and walked toward the music. He entered the ballroom through the service entrance behind the main bar, an area shrouded in deep shadow, where the liquor bottles were stored. He couldn't see the 400 people or the gold banners, but his ears immediately mapped the immense physical volume of the space, the 40-foot ceilings that allowed sound to travel upward before returning with a soft velvet decay. The collective rustle of silk dresses and starched shirts, the tiny metallic clinks of silver forks meeting porcelain plates, and beneath it all, that heavy, oppressive silence of a stage that was dying for a voice. Preston moved with absolute precision. He had mopped this specific floor hundreds of times. He knew the exact distance between the service bar and the edge of the stage steps. His cane tapped once against the bottom step, low, quiet, hidden by the murmuring crowd. He climbed 1 step, 2 steps, 3 steps. He was on the platform now, the heat of the massive theater spotlight hitting the left side of his face like an open oven door. The Steinway grand piano was exactly 6 feet to his left. He could feel its massive physical displacement of air, the way a blind man feels the presence of a brick wall before his face touches it. It was a massive sleeping animal made of wood and wire, completely alive even in its silence. He extended his hand, his fingers finding the smooth, cool edge of the ebony finish, and slid his body onto the padded leather bench. His cane was laid quietly on the floor beside his feet. He lifted his hands, placed his fingers lightly upon the ivory keys, and for 3 seconds the entire universe, the hotel, the billionaire, the rent, the eviction notice, the blindness, and the heavy gray uniform completely ceased to exist. There was only the piano. Then the world broke through the dream with the force of a physical blow. Gerald Whitmore's hand grabbed Preston's collar from behind, jerking him backward, with enough force to make his shoes slide across the stage floor. Preston's foot caught his white cane, sending it clattering across the marble steps with a sharp, hollow sound that echoed into the farthest corners of the ballroom. "What let this monkey near my piano?" Gerald's voice cut through the room like an iron bar smashing through a window pane. The silence that followed Gerald Whitmore's shout was instantaneous and total, a thick, suffocating blanket that dropped over the 400 guests like an executioner's hood. Every single pair of eyes in the ballroom locked onto the stage, where a billionaire in a custom tuxedo was holding a blind black janitor by his shirt collar. Preston didn't resist. He allowed his body to be pulled back, his face remaining turned toward the keyboard he could no longer touch. "I just wanted to play one song, sir," Preston said, his voice low, clear, and completely devoid of the panic that Gerald expected to hear. "Play?" Gerald let out a sharp, ugly laugh that carried across the microphone array near the stage podium. "You hear that? Everyone, the cockroach wants to play my Steinway. Look at these black, cracked hands, stinking of industrial bleach. These are mop rags. These are dirty hands that belong in a toilet bowl. Don't you dare touch my wood again." He gave Preston another shove, sending the old man down onto his knees on the cold marble floor next to the bench. Preston's hands met the stone, his palms absorbing the chill of the floor he had cleaned just 48 hours ago. Gerald turned back toward his friends, his chest heaving slightly with a twisted sense of accomplishment. "Fine play, boy. Show us what a stray dog can do with an instrument like this. Give us a good laugh before security throws you into the street." Preston remained on his knees for 5 seconds. The cold of the marble seeped through his uniform pants, through his skin, and directly into the center of his chest, where his pride had been locked in a dark room for 15 years. He could hear the faint, uncomfortable shifting of the crowd, people adjusting their positions in their chairs. A few men clearing their throats, but not a single voice spoke up to condemn the cruelty they had just witnessed. To them it was just a wealthy man disciplining an insolent servant who had crossed an unwritten line. Preston thought about standing up, finding his broken cane by touch, and walking through the service exit into the alley. He could catch the 8:40 bus, be home by 9, and tomorrow this whole night would just be a bad memory he would never share with anyone. He thought about his rent. He knew with absolute certainty that if he stayed on this stage, if he made a scene, Gerald Whitmore would have him fired before his morning coffee was brewed. He would lose his $12 an hour income, his room, his map of Eleanor's words. His fingers curled against the stone floor, his nails scratching slightly against the wax finish. And then, through the thick silence of his own fear, he heard her. It wasn't a ghost, and it wasn't a miracle. It was just the perfect, unyielding clarity of his own memory waking up. He heard Eleanor's voice from the hospital bed, her breathing shallow, but her grip on his wrist tighter than iron. "Your hands were made for more than this, baby. Don't you dare let them make you forget who you are in the dark." Preston's jaw tightened. His breathing slowed until his chest moved in a steady, deliberate rhythm that matched the ticking of the radiator he had left behind that morning. Something shifted behind his blind features. The submissive, invisible posture of the hotel janitor dropped away like a discarded cloak, replaced by an ancient architectural dignity that had once filled concert halls across Europe. He did not ask for help. He reached out his right hand, located the smooth surface of the piano bench, and pulled himself back up to his feet with a single, unbroken movement. The crowd gasped slightly, expecting him to slink away into the shadows of the wings. Instead, Preston Hayes walked back to the Steinway, adjusted his gray uniform jacket with 2 quick, precise pulls of his hands, and sat back down on the leather bench. Gerald Whitmore spun around, his face darkening with absolute fury as he stepped back toward the stage. "Are you deaf as well as blind, old man? I told you to get your—" "I heard you, sir," Preston said, his voice not loud, but carrying an incredible heavy resonance that seemed to drop the room's temperature by several degrees. "I heard every single word you said, but this piano didn't." Before Gerald could reach out a hand to grab him a second time, Preston's hands came down onto the keys. He began with the opening bars of Chopin's Ballade No. 1 in G minor, Opus 23. The first notes drifted into the vast ballroom like thin streaks of white smoke, fragile, tentative, and deeply hesitant. Each note was placed with the extreme slow care of a man walking across thin ice that he knew could shatter at any second. His left hand was trembling violently, a visible muscular shaking that had nothing to do with fear and everything to do with 15 years of unused art trying to burst through the narrow channels of his fingers all at once. The melody was beautiful, but it was dangerously thin, stretched so tight between hope and hesitation that it felt as if it might snap between the measures. A wealthy real estate developer sitting at table 12 leaned over to his wife with a smug, self-satisfied smirk. "This is embarrassing," he whispered, swirling his scotch. "The old man can barely find the chords. Gerald should have had him arrested." Gerald Whitmore folded his arms across his Tom Ford tuxedo, his smirk returning as he stood just 10 feet away. He tilted his head back, watching Preston's shaking hands with the cruel, clinical amusement of a boy watching a wounded insect crawl across a sidewalk. He had won. The janitor was proving his point for him. The servant class had no business trying to speak the language of high art. 8 bars into the piece, Preston's right hand stumbled. His ring finger landed a fraction of a second late on a high B-flat, causing the harmony to blur into a brief, ugly dissonance. The tremor in his left wrist spread upward into his forearm, his shoulders tightening under the gray polyester of his uniform. For a single terrible suspended second of human time, it appeared that the billionaire was entirely correct. The stray dog couldn't play. The cockroach had no right to be on the stage. The dirty hands were exactly what they looked like, the tools of a man who belonged in the dirt. Preston stopped playing. His hands lifted completely from the ivory keys and hovered exactly 1 inch above the keyboard, frozen in the white glare of the spotlight. The last note he had struck, a low, unresolved F, hung in the air like a question mark, aching for somewhere to go, refusing to die. 1 second of total silence passed, then 2 seconds, then 3, then 4. The ballroom grew so quiet that the sound of the air conditioning system blowing through the gold vents sounded like a distant storm. People glanced at each other uneasily, the initial amusement turning into a sharp, uncomfortable tension. A woman at table 9 pressed her diamond-ringed hand against her mouth, her eyes locked on the old man's back. Gerald unfolded his arms, taking a deep breath to deliver the final order that would send Preston to the curb. But before a single syllable could leave his lips, Preston's fingers came back down. And this time they didn't tremble. The Chopin didn't just return. It exploded out of the Steinway with the terrifying force of an ocean breaking through a concrete dam. The very same ballade, the very same key, the very same notes, but they had been completely transformed by a supernatural clarity that made the air in the ballroom vibrate. Every trace of hesitation was gone, every tremor burned away by a sudden white-hot artistic fury that turned Preston's fingers into 10 perfectly synchronized steel pistons. His left hand drove the bass line down into the floorboards with a massive, thunderous power that vibrated through the legs of every chair in the first 5 rows, causing champagne flutes to dance against the linen tablecloths. His right hand sang the high melody with a clarity so sharp, so piercingly beautiful, it felt like a razor blade drawing a clean, perfect line through the thick, smoky atmosphere of the room. The woman at table 12, who had been reaching for her glass, froze mid-motion, her fingers remaining glued to the crystal because her hand was shaking too hard to lift it. Preston Hayes was no longer an old man in a gray uniform cleaning up after the rich. The janitor had vanished, completely swallowed whole by the return of a master who had performed for the history books. His physical posture had transformed. His wrists were loose, perfectly level fluid as running water. His fingers struck and released the keys with a terrifying mathematical precision that came from a place far beyond mere practice, a sacred domain where the music lived inside the marrow of his bones and the blood of his heart, and his hands were simply the iron gates he had thrown wide open to let the storm out. Gerald Whitmore's smirk did not fade slowly. It vanished from his face instantly like a light bulb being smashed by a stone. He took a full step backward, his arms dropping down to his sides, his chest tightening as the sound waves hit his chest with physical force. Preston didn't notice his retreat. Preston didn't notice anything within the physical geography of the hotel. He was entirely gone, floating inside a brilliant, blinding world of sound, where the 400 wealthy patrons, the crystal chandeliers, and the man who had called him a cockroach could never reach him. He was the music, and the music was him, and the boundary line between human skin and piano wire had dissolved into nothingness. The Chopin built toward its first massive technical climax, a notoriously brutal passage of cascading octaves that required the full physical span of both hands, moving across the entire width of the keyboard. Preston's arms moved in wide, majestic, sweeping arcs, his gray sleeves cutting through the white spotlight like wings. The bass notes grew so deep, so profoundly resonant, that a silver fork rattled loudly against a porcelain plate at table 4. A man in the third row, a retired 4-star general who hadn't stood up for anything less than a national anthem in 20 years, stood up from his chair. Slowly, his eyes wide, his hands gripping the edge of the table as if the floor beneath him were moving. Then, without a single millisecond of pause, without a single break in the frantic rhythm, Preston Hayes shifted the music. The classical structure of Chopin dissolved seamlessly into the wild, roaring opening bars of George Gershwin's Rhapsody in Blue. The transition was so audacious, so mathematically impossible to execute without a score, that a young cellist in the audience, Maya Lin, let out a loud, involuntary sob from her seat. She knew what she was witnessing. This wasn't a man playing 2 different songs from memory. This was a linguistic genius, speaking 2 separate languages fluently within the same sentence, switching between them without a single trace of an accent. The technical skill required to perform that transition on a live stage wasn't just rare, it was historic. The Gershwin danced through the high society ballroom like a wild animal that had escaped from a cage. It broke through the stiff classical conventions and replaced them with syncopated jazz rhythms, notes that bent and swung and refused to land where the wealthy crowd expected them to. Preston's right hand flew up and down the treble keys in brilliant liquid lines that sounded completely improvised, yet every professional musician in the room knew they were perfectly composed. The silence he left between the notes was just as brilliant as the notes themselves, a calculated breathing space that gave the melody room to crush the listener's heart. A waiter standing near the kitchen entrance door let go of his heavy silver tray, allowing 3 clean coffee cups to slide off and smash against the floor. But nobody turned their head to look at the broken ceramic. The sound of the piano had made everything else completely irrelevant. Then Preston shifted the world a 3rd time. This time the crowd felt the transition in their skin before their ears could even process the change. The Gershwin faded out like a brilliant crimson sunset, one bright color bleeding into the dark, quiet shades of evening. And from that dark silence emerged a melody that nobody in that ballroom, nobody in the city of Washington had ever heard before. This was Preston Hayes's own private masterpiece, the piece he had spent 5 years writing for Eleanor, while her body was wasting away in the light of the hospital window. It began with a single isolated note, a middle C struck with the softest pad of his thumb, held for 2 full beats until its echo filled the corners of the platform. Then a second note, then a third. A melody so astonishingly simple it almost didn't feel like art at all. It sounded like a human memory trying to turn itself into a sentence, like a man reaching through the dark for a word he hadn't spoken since his childhood. The melody was Eleanor's laugh preserved in ivory. The piece grew with the slow, terrifying inevitability of a midnight tide coming in to swallow a beach. Layers of complex harmony began to fold in over the simple melody, one on top of another, deepening the simplicity into a massive symphonic architecture of grief. It became clear to everyone listening that this pond had no bottom. Deep, uncomfortable dissonances began to creep into the chords, a passing sharp note here, a flattened fifth there, and the music shifted from an expression of warmth into a raw, stabbing ache that filled the throat. This was the musical translation of the diagnosis, the cold, white room at Johns Hopkins, the specialist's voice explaining with clinical indifference what the word degenerative meant for a young man's eyes, the slow daily closing of the physical world, the light retreating from the edges of his vision until only the center remained, colors fading into gray, faces turning into nothing but disembodied voices, and then the final, complete, and crushing dark. The dissonance built to a terrifying crescendo, layers of chords colliding against each other like tectonic plates, grinding beneath the earth. A wealthy woman in the fourth row, wearing a necklace that could have paid Preston's rent for 40 years, pressed both of her hands hard against her chest, her eyes wide as tears poured down her cheeks, ruining her makeup. She didn't know who Eleanor was. She had never lived in Southeast D.C., and she had never cleaned a floor in her life. But the music knew, and the music was telling her everything she needed to know about what it felt like to lose your world in the dark. And then came the fury. Preston's hands crashed down into the lowest, heaviest register of the Steinway grand piano, striking deep, thunderous chords that sounded like artillery firing in an empty valley. It wasn't the kind of rage that screams and breaks things. It was the controlled, infinite anger of a man who had been completely forgotten by a world he had once served. This was the musical score of the concerts that had stopped coming, the high-priced agents who had stopped returning his calls, the promoters who had looked at a blind black man and decided his story was over before his life had even reached its midpoint. The anger was massive, precise, and entirely disciplined, and that discipline was what made it truly terrifying to behold. The massive crystal chandelier, hanging 40 feet above the stage, began to tremble, not from the physical vibration of the air, but from an acoustic resonance the piano was singing at the exact frequency of the glass, making the crystals hum in a high, thin sympathy that sounded like a chorus of ghosts. Gerald Whitmore's face had gone completely white, the color of skim milk. He stood exactly 10 feet from the stage steps, his long arms hanging limp at his sides, his mouth slightly open like an idiot's. He looked exactly like a man who had spent millions of dollars building a beautiful castle, only to watch a single old man walk in and set the foundations on fire with his bare hands. Slowly, with an agonizing deliberation, Preston allowed the fury to soften. The thunderous bass chords thinned out into single pulsing notes. The sharp dissonance unraveled thread by thread like an old knot being undone by a patient hand. And in its place emerged a resolution, not a cheap happy ending for a television show, but something far more complicated, far more beautiful acceptance. The kind of acceptance that doesn't pretend the pain never happened, but chooses to carry the weight forward into the dark instead of letting it crush your spine. The melody returned Eleanor's laugh, but it was different now. It was older, wiser, wrapped in every single thing that had happened since her heart stopped beating. The loss, the complete blindness, the heavy gray uniform, the smell of commercial bleach, the loneliness, and the 14 steps from the bed to the kitchen counter. All of it had been folded into the melody, changing its texture from smooth silk to scarred iron. This was the exact piece Preston Hayes had performed inside the White House 3 times for 3 different presidents. Every time he had played it, it had been different because every time Preston had been a different man. The composition was alive. It breathed with his lungs. And tonight, inside a ballroom filled with people who had watched him get shoved off a bench onto the floor, it breathed the deepest breath it had ever taken. The final movement began. Preston's hands moved with a supernatural speed, now the melody climbing higher and higher into the bright treble register, every note building upon the spine of the last, stacking toward a climax that the entire room could feel coming like a storm over the horizon. It was a crescendo that didn't just increase in volume, it increased in human meaning. Every single bar of music carried more weight than the one that had preceded it. The music wasn't simply getting louder, it was getting truer. The entire crowd leaned forward, 400 bodies tilting toward the spotlight, like flowers turning toward a sun that was about to go supernova. Then came the peak, a single massive chord that used every single note Preston's long fingers could reach across the wood. It rang through the Grand Meridian ballroom like a massive cathedral bell, shaking the crystal drapes, vibrating the silverware, and pressing against the plaster walls until the room itself seemed to expand. And then Preston pulled his hands back, pianissimo, barely audible. The softest, most delicate playing the room had heard all evening. Each note was a whisper, each rest between the notes a caught breath. The melody dissolved into single tones, spaced further and further apart like stars appearing one by one in a midnight sky over a dark ocean. The very last note, a single sustained low G, floated out into the silence of the room. It didn't end abruptly. It simply faded out slowly, like a candle burning down to nothing in a room where nobody was moving. Preston Hayes lifted his long fingers from the ivory keys and placed them gently in his lap, his head slightly bowed, his blind face wet with sweat and tears. 5 full seconds of absolute silence passed. Nobody breathed. Nobody moved. Nobody existed outside of that room. Then Constance Bellamy, the 76-year-old legendary concert pianist who had heard every single great master of the 20th century, rose from her chair at table 4. She rose slowly with the deep, quiet reverence of a woman entering a cathedral, and she began to clap entirely alone in the silence. Her applause was the only sound in the vast ballroom, steady, deliberate, each clap landing like a heartbeat, restarting a dead body. Senator Elaine Crawford stood up next, then a man at table 10, then a woman across the aisle, then an entire row, and then the ballroom exploded. 400 people rose to their feet in a single violent wave of motion that shook the air in the room. This wasn't the polite, calculated applause that high society gives because the program tells them to. This was a raw, primal roar that ripped out of human throats before their brains could even decide whether to permit it. Hands were slammed together until palms were bruised. Voices broke as they shouted into the glare of the stage. The young cellist Maya Lin was standing on top of her gold ballroom chair, her arms flung high above her head, her face completely covered in tears as she screamed into the noise. Darnell Cooper stood inside the service entrance doorway, his massive frame filling the frame, still wearing his stained porter uniform, one giant hand gripping the wood so hard the paint cracked while his other sleeve wiped his face over and over again. The standing ovation was a physical force, waves of sound rolling over the stage, rebuilding themselves every single time they appeared to be fading out. People weren't just clapping. They were desperate to release the tension that Preston's hands had trapped inside their chests. A man in a $3,000 tuxedo near the back row cupped his hands around his mouth and yelled a name over and over again, his voice lost in the thunder. A woman clutched her husband's arm with both hands, shaking him violently while repeating the same words. Oh my God, what did we just see? Phones were out, dozens of them held high by wealthy hands, recording the old man in the gray uniform from every conceivable angle, the light from their small screens dotting the darkness like low, trembling stars. Gerald Whitmore had not moved a single inch. He stood exactly 10 feet from the stage steps, his long arms hanging down like broken ropes, his pale face cycling through expressions so fast that his features seemed to blur. First came confusion, then a deep, ugly denial, and finally a slow, creeping horror that spread across his face like black ink spilled on white silk. The horror wasn't just that he had been proven wrong. It was that he had been proven wrong publicly, permanently, in front of every single person whose opinion mattered to his social survival. His wife, Audrey Whitmore, had moved not far, just 3 steps to her left, completely separating her body from his shadow. In their world, where she had spent 20 years standing exactly 2 steps behind his right shoulder, those 3 steps were a canyon that could never be bridged again, and every person in the front row noted the distance immediately. The thunderous ovation began to quiet down after 2 full minutes, not because the crowd was tired, but because Senator Elaine Crawford had stepped onto the stage platform, moving with the slow, unhurried authority of a woman who had run congressional committees for 30 years. Someone handed her a wireless microphone. She looked at Preston Hayes for 5 seconds, her eyes shining in the spotlight, and then she turned her face toward the 400 guests who were still standing. "The man who just sat at this piano," Senator Crawford said, her voice steady but vibrating with an intense, controlled anger that filled the speakers, "is Preston Hayes. He is a graduate of the Thornton Conservatory of Music. He performed at 3 consecutive White House state dinners at the personal request of 3 different presidents of this country. His original compositions have been performed for heads of state at the NATO summit in Geneva. He has played for diplomats, for queens, and for audiences that understood what genius sounded like." She paused, letting the silence do its heavy work upon the room's conscience. "The man your host just called a cockroach, the man. He shoved off that bench and told to go back to his toilets, played for the leaders of the free world, while most of you were still trying to figure out how to inherit your money. And he did it tonight, with more grace than anyone in this ballroom has displayed all evening." The room didn't erupt into cheers. It cracked open with a low collective groan, the sound of 400 wealthy people confronting the immense distance between who they thought they were and what they had just allowed to happen in their presence. Gerald Whitmore finally moved. He walked toward the stage steps, his legs stiff and mechanical, his hands twitching at his sides as he tried to perform a composure he didn't possess. He stopped at the foot of the piano bench, cleared his throat twice, and spoke into the quiet air, his voice a full octave higher than its normal register. I didn't know, Mr. Hayes. If I had been informed of your previous status, if I had known who you were." Preston Hayes turned his blind face slowly toward the sound of the billionaire's voice. His features were perfectly calm, entirely devoid of triumph or anger. They were just clean. "You didn't need to know who I was, sir. Preston said, his voice carrying clearly to the back row without the aid of a microphone. "You only needed to know who you were." The ballroom erupted a second time, louder than the first, the sound of Gerald's social circle turning on him like a pack of wolves. The billionaire stood there with his mouth half open, his sentence unfinished, his apology unaccepted, looking entirely small in the center of his own world. There is a profound difference between being humbled and being made small. Humility is a spiritual choice. Smallness is what happens when the universe finally forces you to look at your actual size in the mirror. Constance Bellamy stepped onto the platform next, her old hand reaching out to find Preston's. Guided by the crisp sound of her shoes, Preston extended his right palm, and the two pianists clasped hands beneath the burning white spotlight. "I have waited 40 years to hear someone play that Chopin ballade the way I always heard it inside my own head." Constance said, her voice quiet, spoken only for his ears. "Where have you been, Preston?" Preston. Hayes smiled, his thumb brushing the empty valley where Eleanor's gold used to live. "Right here, ma'am, cleaning the floors." 400 people rose to their feet in a single violent wave of motion that shook the air in the room. This wasn't the polite, calculated applause that high society gives because the program tells them to. This was a raw, primal roar that ripped out of human throats before their brains could even decide whether to permit it. Hands were slammed together until palms were bruised. Voices broke as they shouted into the glare of the stage. The young cellist Maya Lin was standing on top of her gold ballroom chair, her arms flung high above her head, her face completely covered in tears as she screamed into the noise. Darnell Cooper stood inside the service entrance doorway, his massive frame filling the frame, still wearing his stained porter uniform. One giant hand gripping the wood so hard the paint cracked, while his other sleeve wiped his face over and over again. The standing ovation was a physical force. Waves of sound rolling over the stage, rebuilding themselves every single time they appeared to be fading out. People weren't just clapping. They were desperate to release the tension that Preston's hands had trapped inside their chests. A man in a $3,000 tuxedo near the back row cupped his hands around his mouth and yelled a name over and over again, his voice lost in the thunder. A woman clutched her husband's arm with both hands, shaking him violently while repeating the same words, "Oh my God, oh my God, what did we just see?" Phones were out, dozens of them held high by wealthy hands, recording the old man in the gray uniform from every conceivable angle, the light from their small screens dotting the darkness like low, trembling stars. Gerald Whitmore had not moved a single inch. He stood exactly 10 feet from the stage steps, his long arms hanging down like broken ropes, his pale face cycling through expressions so fast that his features seemed to blur. First came confusion, then a deep, ugly denial, and finally a slow, creeping horror that spread across his face like black ink spilled on white silk. The horror wasn't just that he had been proven wrong. It was that he had been proven wrong publicly, permanently, in front of every single person whose opinion mattered to his social survival. His wife, Audrey Whitmore, had moved not far, just 3 steps to her left, completely separating her body from his shadow. In their world, where she had spent 20 years standing exactly 2 steps behind his right shoulder, those 3 steps were a canyon that could never be bridged again, and every person in the front row noted the distance immediately. The thunderous ovation began to quiet down after 2 full minutes, not because the crowd was tired, but because Senator Elaine Crawford had stepped onto the stage platform, moving with the slow, unhurried authority of a woman who had run congressional committees for 30 years. Someone handed her a wireless microphone. She looked at Preston Hayes for 5 seconds, her eyes shining in the spotlight, and then she turned her face toward the 400 guests who were still standing. "The man who just sat at this piano," Senator Crawford said, her voice steady, but vibrating with an intense, controlled anger that filled the speakers, "is Preston Hayes. He is a graduate of the Thornton Conservatory of Music. He performed at 3 consecutive White House state dinners at the personal request of 3 different presidents of this country. His original compositions have been performed for heads of state at the NATO summit in Geneva. He has played for diplomats, for queens, and for audiences that understood what genius sounded like." She paused, letting the silence do its heavy work upon the room's conscience. "The man your host just called a cockroach, the man he shoved off that bench and told to go back to his toilets, played for the leaders of the free world, while most of you were still trying to figure out how to inherit your money. And he did it tonight with more grace than anyone in this ballroom has displayed all evening." The room didn't erupt into cheers. It cracked open with a low, collective groan, the sound of 400 wealthy people confronting the immense distance between who they thought they were and what they had just allowed to happen in their presence. Gerald Whitmore finally moved. He walked toward the stage steps, his legs stiff and mechanical, his hands twitching at his sides as he tried to perform a composure he didn't possess. He stopped at the foot of the piano bench, cleared his throat twice, and spoke into the quiet air, his voice a full octave higher than its normal register. I didn't know, Mr. Hayes. If I had been informed of your previous status, if I had known who you were—" Preston Hayes turned his blind face slowly toward the sound of the billionaire's voice. His features were perfectly calm, entirely devoid of triumph or anger. They were just clean. "You didn't need to know who I was, sir," Preston said, his voice carrying clearly to the back row without the aid of a microphone. "You only needed to know who you were." The ballroom erupted a second time, louder than the first, the sound of Gerald's social circle turning on him like a pack of wolves. The billionaire stood there with his mouth half open, his sentence unfinished, his apology unaccepted, looking entirely small in the center of his own world. There is a profound difference between being humbled and being made small. Humility is a spiritual choice. Smallness is what happens when the universe finally forces you to look at your actual size in the mirror. Constance Bellamy stepped onto the platform, next her old hand reaching out to find Preston's. Guided by the crisp sound of her shoes, Preston extended his right palm, and the 2 pianists clasped hands beneath the burning white spotlight. "I have waited 40 years to hear someone play that Chopin ballade the way I always heard it inside my own head," Constance said, her voice quiet, spoken only for his ears. "Where have you been, Preston?" Hayes smiled, his thumb brushing the empty valley where Eleanor's gold used to live. "Right here, ma'am, cleaning the floors."